Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris, and welcome to our first guest interview. Our guest interviews are long-form interviews with leaders from around the world. They've each sent in answers to questions we provided, and were selected to join us because we know our listeners will get a lot out of it. So today we're joined by Shedletzky, the head of brand experience for Sinek Inc. Welcome, Stephen. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hello, I'm Stephen. It's great to be here with you, Chris, and to share with your audience.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Just a little bit of background. Tell us about what your leadership background is. When you went from jobs in your life where you weren't leading people to the first job where you actually had to deal with either direct reports or influencing how people are led, and how that transition was for you. How'd you end up where you are?
Sure. So I'm a real big proponent of getting involved beyond the classroom when you're in high school, even elementary school or college, university. So my first leadership experience was, I'd say, in university, when I was presented with the option to join a fraternity, and myself and a few other buddies just decided to start one. We didn't really want to expose ourselves to the hierarchical nature that is frequent in fraternities on campus, and we just decided to make our own. And
That's
I
awesome.
became the president as a freshman. And it was brilliant. And we decided to launch a fraternity that focused more on getting involved in the community and philanthropic efforts. That's what defined us.
That's fantastic.
And I mean, it was hard. And I remember coming back from the winter holiday break, and we had a big fundraising event coming up, and it felt like it was all on my shoulders. And I remember distinctively, like nearly in tears in front of 25 guys. I think everyone was a teenager. Maybe we had one 20-year-old, and just asking for help and saying, I can't do this on my own. That was the very first leadership experience that I had. And I've been on our team at Sinek for 8 years. I was the fourth person to join our team, so I was definitely in an individual contributor role then.
Mm-hmm.
But over time have had formal roles of leadership on our team. And I'm also a parent, which I think there's no better analogy to leadership than parenting.
Mm-hmm.
So I've learned a ton. Things that have been great and made me so proud, and things that make me want to pull more of my hair out. But that's leadership. Leadership, I think, is the hardest job because it's human and it's messy. And we have books and podcasts and resources like these because if it was straightforward, we wouldn't need this.
Yeah.
Leadership is not straightforward.
No, not at all. One of the first things you said there was that you I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounded like you had a little bit of an aversion to hierarchy, and that's why you wanted to start your own fraternity instead of joining one that already existed. You didn't like the hierarchical nature of fraternities. What was it about that?
Well, I'm not averse to hierarchy when hierarchy makes sense.
Okay.
I'm averse to hierarchy when I don't think hierarchy makes sense. I think hierarchy doesn't make sense when it's abused. I think my aversion to hierarchy in the context of fraternities on campus where I was that you weren't treated well when you were junior. And so it's in the fabric of the culture that you treat those who were younger than you without respect or consideration.
Yeah.
Pardon my French, but that's bullshit.
Yeah.
That's just not good human nature.
I agree.
I'm all good with hierarchy. There are people more senior to me who I can learn from. Sometimes you're just more senior to me because of circumstances, but that's okay. I still have to respect it. Like if you hold the office of the president, I may not like you, but I will respect your authority, because I think there are times where hierarchy makes complete sense. But I think hierarchy and power ought not to be abused. I think it needs to be held with great discretion.
I agree with that. I also think there are elements of Milgram in there a little bit in terms of doing what you're told.
Sure.
And there are also elements of this is the way we do it because this is the way we've always done it. And I think that not just in hierarchies, but in a lot of things that can happen in organizations where you find yourself doing something incorrectly, but it was correct when it was started. It had the best of intentions, but then all of a sudden you find yourself going, wait, why do we do this? And no one has the courage to ask, no one has the courage to challenge it. So, sometimes it takes starting your own fraternity to get there, right?
Or people do have the courage to challenge it, and the response is they're reprimanded or fired, which then gives no one else the courage to do it following.
Exactly.
Or
You have an outlier
people.
every once in a while, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a big piece around, I've learned in my journey as a leader on our team at Simon Sinek. I mean, we preach a pretty big message.
Oh yeah.
And yet we don't live it perfectly inside of our company. And I used to think that was bad, but it's not.
No.
The real test of leadership is not creating an organization where everything goes perfectly, because that's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
It's about creating a culture and a condition in which people feel safe to bring up tensions and conflicts, and then you just deal with them in a responsible, human, thoughtful, empathetic way. That's leadership. And the reason we don't have movies about it is because it's boring.
It's boring when it's not happening to you. When you're the protagonist in that story, it's not boring. It can be life-changing in a positive or a negative way. But yeah, watching it happen to other people is it's not very intriguing.
Sure. Yeah, no, I definitely get that.
When did you decide that you wanted to lead people as opposed to being an individual contributor? I mean, it wasn't just, I want a higher salary and I want more responsibility. It's like, there's something that people have in them when they decide, you know what, I want to help other people realize their goals and dreams or whatever that is. When did that happen for you?
Two moments are pivotal for me. One, in my last year at university, I met a professor who changed my life. One of my most profound mentors, a guy by the name of Dr. Dennis Shackle. And he just showed me what fulfillment is. Like you can read a dictionary definition of a term, and then when you live it, you get it. And fulfillment is when we use our gifts and strengths to positively impact others, to contribute to something bigger than ourselves. Mm-hmm. And he facilitated and generated that experience for myself in multiple classes that I was in with him. And then my first job out of college was in a, quote, leadership development program. And I went, leadership, yeah, right?
Right.
The only issue is I forgot to ask them what their definition of the term was, because it turns out we don't have a standard definition of leader or leadership. And so I learned, though I don't even know if they'd say this, but I learned their definition was more around authority and your contribution to the P&L, which is not my definition. Right. I don't make you wrong or bad for it. I believe there are different and better ways. But on my first day at my first job at a school, 1,000 people were let go, and I was walking in. It was post-merger. And I saw the impact of uncertainty and lack of transparency and clear communication from leaders on people's future. And they didn't communicate it because they didn't know themselves. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make it right. Right. It just meant that they played it close to the chest because they didn't know, versus just being transparent. Because absent of sharing a narrative, people make it up.
Yes, they do.
And I saw rates of cancer. I saw car accidents, and not to mention people's productivity. I saw negative impacts everywhere. And that experience, when I felt unmotivated, disengaged, uninspired, unfulfilled, depressed, quite frankly, I was only in that job for a year, but by month 7, 8, 9, I literally looked at oncoming traffic and thought about it as an option. It was that bad. And I was just 9 months into my career, not to mention someone who's been there for 30, 35 years. And that, when I saw how sort of those dichotomies of, I experienced fulfillment and I saw the impact of a great leader on people's self-confidence, on people's growth, health, and well-being, and people contributing and helping each other. And then I went into the real world and saw the very opposite. I knew I wanted to devote myself to a life that helped others feel engaged, inspired, and fulfilled, and safe. And I just knew that if I did that for others, I would feel it myself. I never made it about having formal leadership or not. I just made it about a commitment to a life of service. And fortunately, I've had some chances to formally lead people along the way, and take some accountability and responsibility for their growth, or rather inspire them to take accountability and responsibility for their own growth.
It's amazing how, as people, we need the sweet and the sour, in order to shape who we are. And, I wonder how much longer you would have been in that role, the negative role that you had you not had the professor beforehand to show you what the potential was. How long would you have tried to stick it out, or just that, I guess this is life, I mean, that's, they've kind of worked together. That's really cool.
I've often had that debate in my head of can you have the sugar without the salt? And maybe, like, could you, in an idealized way, help a child understand their strengths, put them into curriculum and programs and job opportunities that, like, maybe, but still you're going to lose friends, you're going to have relationship issues, you're going to have a cruddy like, I totally agree with you that it is the both spectrums.
Right.
And as a parent now, I describe parenting as both the best and worst thing and the best and hardest thing that's happened to me in my life. But it's those dichotomies that help give me perspective and appreciate the sweet and try to improve the sour.
Yeah, I've worked with organizations with high turnover, and a lot of times when people are in their first jobs, they don't realize how good they have something if they have it, and they'll leave because there's one or two things that bother them, they don't like about the organization, or whatever the case is. And so they'll leave, they'll go somewhere else. And maybe they were able to solve those one or two things, but it was at the expense of other things. And maybe overall it was a good move for them, but maybe overall they go, wait a minute, what did I give up here? And so, yeah, I think it's human nature to want to think that we can always do better. And it's hard to know what better is if we don't have a baseline, if we don't know what's possible on the other side too. That we can't just be thinking that, I have it great. No one doesn't take what they have for granted if all they have is good stuff. It's not humanly possible, I don't think so. Tell me about a time when you learned a lesson while you were leading people, where it changed the way you lead people. Like, where you were doing something, you thought it was the right way to do it, and because of an interaction or an incident or something that happened, you thought, what, maybe I'm close to right, or maybe I'm totally wrong, and I got to change the way I do things here.
I mean, I tend to think in people, so I'm scanning through the people
Sure.
that have led me or I've led. There's one instance, and this is where I think organizational values also come in handy.
Mm-hmm.
There's one person that there are many people, but one person's coming to mind who were very different, and we have different preferences. And you take any personality assessment or DISC assessment or whatever, we always end up on polars.
Sure.
And we're a remote team. So, I can't just walk down to their office and just pop in. And I find for people who are like, I'm extroverted. I love to collaborate sometimes to a fault, meaning I'm not really good at getting stuff done if I'm alone. There are moments of brilliance and of productivity, but like, I'm at my best when I hop on a call and we work together. And then there are people who are totally opposite of that.
Yep.
And I'm really open. So I'm like, Chris, we need to have a feedback conversation. Or Chris, I'm struggling and I need to get into it with you. Like, is now a good time to have, to get there? And I struggle when there are people who are on the opposite spectrum. And I constantly, and sometimes people who I'm more senior to, but it doesn't make me more important than them. Like why should they flex to me? I met a CEO last week who leads a for impact organization. I just don't like calling organizations not for profit, because who wants to wake up and say, I'm not for something? No, you're for impact. And he did the DISC assessment, and he was high D, high directive, high aggression, high action, be short and brief. And he had at the time about 65 people who worked with him. He had the highest D in the organization. Many people weren't. And the consultant that they brought in said to this guy, these are all the adjustments you need to make. And he said, well, wouldn't it just be more convenient for all of them to adjust to me? And he said, spoken like a true high D. But yeah, I mean, I've struggled with someone who's opposite to me. And I think the thing I'm working on is not making them wrong or me right or me wrong and them right. It just is. And how do you make the time to still get into the tension and conflict, even though every time it feels hard?
Mm-hmm.
And even further, when you're part of a culture, how can you steep into something bigger than yourself around here's how I'm viewing this value? Here's how I'm viewing, we say this, how can we reconcile? How can we improve? So I don't know. I'm not sure if that gives you a clear answer, but just I think I've gotten into trouble in the past when I'm in the perspective that my way is right. And I'm far more effective when I lead with empathy and with a more mindful perspective of it just is. And how do we work with is rather than right or wrong?
Yeah, I think more people, not just in leadership style, but in a lot of things in life, there are things where there's room for us all. There doesn't have to be one or even two or even 100 ways. There could be a lot of different ways to do things.
Or even for me, just because I work better with people and they don't, if we're collaborating on something, if they don't want to collaborate in that way with me, how can I still create that out in some other way?
Right.
Rather than just not making any progress at all.
Right. If you value the relationship, then it's incumbent upon you to, I don't want to say change yourself, but it's incumbent upon you to find a way through. If you value the relationship and you value the potential work that could happen.
Well, we can spend a lifetime trying to change others, and that won't be very productive.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I think leadership has changed a lot over the last 50 years. And if we look back at who we consider to be great leaders over the last 50 years, the styles are very different. Some of the people who we would consider to be amazing leaders 50 years ago, they'd have 100+% turnover annually today.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the people who are great leaders today probably wouldn't move up very far in organizations 50 years ago. What do you think has brought that about? Do you think employees are demanding it? Do you think people are just naturally changing? Do you think, what do you think has caused that kind of evolution to happen where the leaders of our parents' generation just are having a hard time speaking the language of today, and the leaders of today are more in tune with those soft skills?
Yeah, I mean, I don't call them soft skills. I call them human skills.
I like that better.
Yeah. One is we live in a time of greater general affluence, like in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think we live in a time, and if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have more of our basic needs met. You look at a typical millennial today, and like, if we don't get a job, we can live in our parents' basement or find a way, I'm not saying that's pervasive across everywhere, because that's not true of everyone. But I think if you look at us, we live in a time of more general affluence, which gives us this notion of fulfillment is closer to us than it's been in the past, which is fantastic. You also look at the theories that were popularized in the 70s and 80s, and it was Milton Friedman and Jack Welch.
Yep.
Greed is good, and the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value, which I don't agree with. I would resonate more with Adam Smith's definition of the purpose of business is to serve consumers, and the way you serve consumers is through your people, right? And I'm a really big advocate of focusing on inputs rather than outputs. Even if you look at a program like Kaizen, which is continuous improvement out of Japan and popularized with Toyota, it's all about people. It's all about inputs. They brought it over to the US and they made it all about efficiency. No, it doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
It's like only celebrating your kids if they score a goal in soccer, not if they were a good teammate.
Right.
So, I mean, in some respects, I think leadership is leadership. You go back to the origins of our species. We're a tribal species. We lived in tribes of 150. We no longer really live in tribes of 150. I think scale has gotten in the way because we're not a species designed for scale. But like, I'm more of the thought of the sapiens perspective that leadership is leadership, and the environment around us has shifted. Right? If you were a leader in tribal times and you ran away when a predator threatened the tribe, guess what? You're not a leader.
Right.
The definition of leader is when danger threatens the tribe, you were the first to step forward and take a risk and even sacrifice your own well-being or life to serve the others. And I mean, this is biological. We give you the first cut of meat. We give you the first choice of mate because you get higher levels of serotonin, which means when a saber-toothed tiger shows up to eat us, you're there. It's not for free. And we've gotten it backwards because we don't operate at scale. So for a CEO who says, I care about all 125,000 people who work at this company, that's biologically a lie. You can't. All you can do is care about your 150 such that your 150 cares for theirs. And that spills to the point that the most junior people feel that they're cared for because their leader cares for them. The people around them care for them. And further, we don't have an issue with the bonus that bankers take. We have an issue when you have in the same year record high bonuses, the same year you have record high layoffs. That's just wrong.
Yes. That's taking the meat and the mate and then running away from the saber-toothed tiger.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Bingo.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Chris, I'd rather look at what is in our nature than, I think leadership is leadership. Good leadership is good leadership. And there were great examples in the 50s and there are great examples today. I think, though, that, we've evolved. We've evolved to have just as many women in the workforce as men, which is great. I think we need leaders to have more female type characteristics of nurturing and sensitive and empathy. We need a balance of both. And as women really entered the workforce into the 80s, at first they thought they needed to act like men, and they did to fit in, and power to them for taking the risk and blazing a path. But we're getting back towards center and realizing that people want to be treated as people. People want to feel like they're a part of something bigger than just making profit for owners or shareholders. So I think, there were theories popularized in the 70s and 80s that we're seeing the negative impact. And we're seeing that Goliaths can crumble. Look at Lehman Brothers, right? And I think we're seeing that for Davids or Goliaths to be relevant and to matter in the long run, people need to feel that they're contributing to something bigger than themselves. They need to feel safe when they show up to work. And at their best, they need to be inspired by what they're doing and who they're doing it with. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but those are a few thoughts.
It answers a lot of it. The only thing I'll add to it is do you think they've always wanted that and they just didn't have recourse when they weren't getting it? Or do you think that what people want from their leaders has actually changed?
I think there's a shift in consciousness. I think if you ask someone in the 1960s, do you want to feel part of an organization in which you feel inspired, safe, and fulfilled, even if they didn't have the words? Like, yeah, of course.
Sure.
We're just evolving. We're just evolving. And I think there's a higher level of consciousness. Like 10 years ago, you couldn't talk about purpose.
No.
Right? But now everyone does. The number of people that abuse it, though, and put up a wonderful purpose on their website, and it's just that, fluff on a website.
Yeah.
Right? And there are countless examples of this. I mean, you look at a company like CVS that took cigarettes off their store shelves, which is a great representation of, we're a healthcare company. We believe in healthy lifestyles. Do you know that who also has that on their website? Rite Aid and Walgreens. They still sell cigarettes.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying CVS is perfect, and if they really want to live their purpose, maybe they should look at the candy bars at checkout too. But it's a step in the right direction. And so I fundamentally don't believe that what makes a good leader has shifted. I just think that we're realizing the popularity of short-termism that were theories in relative times of peace in the 70s and 80s that became popularized through the 90s, and that we're now seeing, not sure if it's the best way, and it's a little finite focused, and it's a little focused on the individual leader and not the legacy of the organization. There has to be a better way.
Do you think that practice is widespread, of whatever the credo says, whatever the purpose says, whatever's painted on the wall of the break room not being lived? Do you think that is incredibly widespread, or do you think it's, I want to say not the opposite of widespread, but do you think it's unintentional? Do you think it just kind of happens and when we don't focus on it? Or do you think that there are people who just think that it's supposed to be a motivational quote and we don't actually do that here?
I think there's a couple things. I think, we have a failure in leadership, and not necessarily at the highest levels of organizations. It's more so in the middle. B, there are pressures that make this stuff really hard, like Wall Street, which is a joke. And like CEOs know what Wall Street and investors and analysts are forcing the organization to do. The leaders know it's not in the best interest of the organization for the long term, but the pressures are so hard
Yeah.
that they make decisions that are actually not in their best interest.
Right.
But we need people to stand up. People like Doug Parker, who's the CEO of American Airlines, saying, I'm aware that I have two types of shareholders and two types of investors. I have ones like Berkshire Hathaway, who care about the long-term success of my organization. And then I have the Merriweather fans who infuse and then take out. And it's more of a gamble rather than investment. And we're only going to make decisions to please the investors, not the gamblers. And the gamblers won't like some of the decisions we make, but we're not making decisions based upon them.
Do you think the investors need to be more vocal? Because it feels like the gamblers are the ones that are the loudest voices in the room sometimes. And a lot of times that can drive a lot of the decisions where maybe the leaders of organizations, maybe they instinctively know that the investors matter, but if all they're hearing, if the squeaky wheel is only the gambler, what does a person do under those circumstances?
Yeah, I think they're the loud minority though. But I think we're moving in the right direction. I really do. But it takes courage to stand up like Doug Parker did and say, I still think the vast majority of investors care primarily about their own return, which means they're not a service-oriented, long-term minded investor. So funny little story from the side that may shed some light here. Simon, our founder, recently gave a talk in London, and there was a long Q&A period. And during the Q&A, there was this gentleman who spoke up and asked a question and essentially said, I love all these concepts on the infinite game and all these things you're talking about, but what do I do when I have investors breathing down my neck to provide them with a return? And Simon asked, who chose the investors? And he said, I did. And he said, you made your own bed. Now, if you're a public company, you're a public company.
Sure.
But you can still say we're catering to the investors who believe in what we're doing over the next 5 to 15 years, not the next quarter. And we're willing to take hits from Wall Street quarter by quarter. Like when CVS made the decision to literally take off the shelves something that made them $1.5 billion annually, not to mention the additional $500 million from auxiliary sales of people would also buy a candy bar, right?
Sure.
They literally lost $2 billion of revenue overnight. And Wall Street bashed them, but their stock price actually went up very shortly after because there's investor confidence and they're clear on who they are. And there were so many health-based companies and vendors who weren't willing to do business with CVS because they sold cigarettes. And once CVS made that decision, all of a sudden you open yourself up to a whole new pool of partners who want their products on your shelves.
It sounds like once you figure out what your North Star is, and you make decisions in spirit of that only, I'm sure it was stressful, but it could be freeing too, because it helps you kind of narrow your focus and say, you know what, it's real easy to say, does this fit with what we are, with who we are, or does this not fit? And if it doesn't fit, but it's a moneymaker, the gamble is that staying true to who we are is what will actually make us more in the long run than trying to be everything to everybody.
Totally. And ultimately, who decides if your stock price goes up? Your customers and your employees. Often your most junior employees have the most contact with your customer. And like some more fun facts, when CVS took cigarettes off the shelves, the total market of cigarettes in the US went down by 1%. It just shrunk. And the reason is 70% of smokers don't want to smoke. But the very remedies that get them off the addiction, nicotine patches, nicotine gum, this isn't an endorsement for nicotine, but those products are sold next to the very thing they're addicted to. Yeah. And now when someone went to their CVS, which is their spot or one of their spots to buy cigarettes, and they said pack of whatever, they went, we don't sell cigarettes anymore. Would you like a nicotine patch? And they went, yeah.
I mean, you don't put the advertisement for AA next to the bottle of whiskey. They don't.
Right. Yeah.
And that's an obvious one. Why isn't the other one too?
Yeah.
The last question I have for you here is, give me some examples of what you think will be important characteristics over the next 5 years in leaders. Maybe ones that you are starting to see, or ones that they're already there and you want them to continue. If there are new leaders kind of coming up.
Yeah. So I think it's balance. So. And this comes from what we're currently working on. Simon's coming out with his next book called The Infinite Game. And it builds upon James Carsey's work. James Carsey wrote this little book in 1986 called Finite and Infinite Games on game theory. And I think most leaders don't understand the game they're actually playing. And I referenced before, Chris, that the number of organizations that I see, there's a high-performing team in the C-suite, but they don't pass it down the organization. Like, we create high-performing teams at the top such that you extend that to the next level and so on and so on. We need more leadership training programs for middle managers, not just the top.
Yeah.
It's, that's an aside. But so Simon's new book on the infinite game, there are finite and infinite games. So finite games have known players, agreed upon rules, and a clear objective. There's a clear beginning, middle, and end. Baseball. Finite games end. Infinite games have known and unknown players. A new player can enter. The rules can change. You can make them up. And the objective is to keep the game at play. It never ends. Business, nonprofit organizations or for impact organizations, government, all of our jobs, though they may have finite components, are infinite games. Our careers are infinite. I can't tell you I'm winning career. That's stupid. I can't tell you I'm winning marriage. And I certainly can't tell you I'm winning government or business. Again, there are finite wins, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the difference between politicians in our part of the world, in North America, and politicians in China. In China, political parties talk about 1,000-year visions that they're attempting to advance. In our part of the world, we're just obsessed with winning the next election. Think of the decisions and the mindset of those two different political parties. Totally different.
Yeah.
And so business, for impact organizations, government, it's all infinite games, but the vast majority of players are playing by finite rules. And so I think you need a balance of knowing, I really want I want leaders to acknowledge that if your team doesn't hit an arbitrary goal by the fiscal year, but everything is trending in the right direction, you still give them a bonus. Versus a team that hits the goal, but morale is low. They had to slash prices. They had to do all of these things to reach the number, and you give them a bonus? No. I think we need to focus on the inputs rather than the outputs. And I think we need to know that though it's important to have finite metrics and goals, I think it would behoove us to pay more close attention to the trends rather than the absolutes.
I think it changes the mindset of who your opponent is. If in a finite game, there's a clear defined opponent. It's the other team, whoever it is. If the goal is to keep the game going, then all the players are on your team. They're all on your team, and the opponent is the stagnation or death of the business, or the country or whatever it is. So I think it changes your mindset about who you're fighting against or what you're fighting against.
Absolutely. And that's one of the practices, which is to study worthy rivals. In the infinite game, your number one competition is you. And there are worthy rivals, which could be other players in your industry. It could be a force. Mm-hmm. Like I did some work last week with a bunch of pastors, church leaders. And one of the forces we discussed was apathy. Apathy is a worthy rival. Or the beach. The beach is one of your worthy rivals if you're a minister.
Yeah.
Right? And so how do you look at the other players or forces or feelings as opportunities to improve your play in what you're attempting to advance?
Yeah, I love it. Stephen, thank you so much for spending time with me here today. We really appreciate it. We hope this is the first of many interactions we get to have with you over the years. If you want to share your contact and social media information for our listeners, I'm sure they'll give you a visit.
Awesome. Yeah, you can learn more about our work at simonsinek.com. And you can find me in all the normal places. Twitter, I'm most active on LinkedIn. Just search my name, Stephen Shedletzky.
Thank you so much, Stephen. You have a wonderful afternoon. And please, listeners, give us some feedback on this. This was hopefully our first of many of these guest speaker introductions. And we want to know if we're on the right track. So please send us messages like you always do. And let us know if there's something you want to see more of or less of. And we hope to keep meeting you where you are.